there's so many important things to think about. And everybody's fixated on this climate emergency, which is a totally bogus narrative. CO2 is the basis of all life. The sugar that is made by photosynthesis is the energy for all life, including our own every day.
All right, guys, welcome back to Yanasa TV's As a Man Thinketh. Love him or hate him, our guest today is a man who is no stranger to controversy. As a doctor of ecology from the University of British Columbia, and he actually has an honorary doctorate of science from NC State University. Patrick Moore has been on both the front lines of the environmental movement, and he has, some would say he's been on the front lines of the opposite side. However, I would argue that as an ecologist, Patrick Moore takes a realistic standpoint to science, and the things and points that he has to say will really make you think about our environment, our climate, and what impacts we make that are good and what impacts we make that are bad. He's not saying that all of our impacts are beneficial. Patrick Moore has a lot of great insight on this subject, and so I asked him to come on to the show to kind of help share some of that insight with you guys and help people start to see things from a perspective. Not all scientists agree with some sort of consensus out there, and I think that the more you listen to different people with doctorate degrees and real PhDs, the more you'll start to hear differences of opinion on this subject, and they're all very educated. I like Patrick Moore's opinion on some things. He and I don't agree on everything, but like I've said before on our channel, that's not what this is about. This is about helping people start to think for themselves, and we're not going to do that unless we hear the whole conversation. So welcome to the show, Patrick Moore.
Now, just one thing. What is Yanasa?
Yanasa it's Musqueam for bison.
Oh.
So we actually, we started our ranch here in North Carolina. We were going to have bison on it. And then we figured out that the fencing was way more expensive than we had anticipated. And so we now have some cows and chickens and sheep and stuff. But you probably know from LinkedIn, we have a nonprofit that promotes regenerative agriculture.
Yes.
And I kind of view regenerative agriculture as important because soil health is important if you want to keep growing food. It has economical benefits as far as the farmer's concerned, because when you farm correctly on your land, you don't have as many inputs. And it's just an overall healthier process for the animals and the products you're putting out. But carbon placement is important, but carbon in and of itself is, it's life on our planet, so, and I think that that's one of the things I'm hoping you can help clarify. And part of this video is a little more about the carbon cycle and what exactly carbon is, because too many people view it as a pollutant. They don't realize that it's actually a necessary part of our ecosystem. Our entire ecosystem is a carbon ecosystem. So,
absolutely, yes.
So, Patrick, you were a co-founder and leader of Greenpeace, which is a global environmental organization. It's become one of the larger environmental organizations. How did you get involved with Greenpeace in the beginning?
Well, I was doing a PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia, having come from the northern tip of Vancouver Island in a very remote village called Winter Harbor. I'd lived in nature all through my childhood, on the tide flats and in the forest, on boats, because there was no road even to the village. It was an outport, as they'd call it in Newfoundland. And I was sent to boarding school in Vancouver, excelled in the life sciences, and realized that having grown up in nature, that's what I really loved, was the living world. And so I enrolled in a PhD in ecology. Before that word was known in the popular press, environment was being discussed, and it was the emerging consciousness of the environment, and also the threat of all-out nuclear war, as it was the height of the Cold War and the Vietnam War, in 1971 when I joined this little group while doing my PhD in a church basement in Vancouver that was planning a protest voyage against US hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. So I was in at the very close to the beginning of it. And I sailed on that boat along with 11 other activists. We looked like a bunch of hippies because it was the hippie era, but pretty well all of us were professionals of one sort or another, journalists and professors, and myself, a budding ecologist. And we succeeded. President Nixon canceled the 5 megaton hydrogen bomb tests after that one went off because of the spearhead we had created by sending a boat across the ocean towards the tests. It was based on a Quaker movement out of Hawaii when the nuclear tests were being done in the atmosphere at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. They sailed a sailboat out from Hawaii, and of course it was stopped immediately by the Coast Guard because they were from the United States and they were protesting against the United States, whereas we were from Canada, so we could get out into international waters and continue all the way across the Gulf of Alaska. And we got arrested by the Coast Guard, which actually made huge news. And we were a big part of the mass demonstration against US hydrogen bomb testing. And President Nixon canceled that series of tests 2 months after that. And so we had a huge victory. And next we went on to being against French atmospheric nuclear testing. France was still testing hydrogen and atomic bombs in the atmosphere in French Polynesia at Mururoa Atoll. We sent a boat there 2 years in a row, protested in Notre Dame Cathedral, went to the first UN conference on the environment in Stockholm in 72, and got a motion put on the floor by New Zealand to condemn French atmospheric nuclear testing against the wishes of the nuclear powers. They said, no, you can't talk about that here. This is about environment. It's not about peace and war. But actually, nuclear radiation going all around the world from nuclear tests is kind of about the environment. And most countries agreed with that and overwhelmingly voted to condemn those tests. And France gave in and took those tests underground. At least they weren't spreading radiation around the world anymore. So we had accomplished 2 major victories with just a few little people in a boat. And so we did have an international perspective from the very beginning, a global perspective. And then we took on the campaign to stop the slaughter of 30,000 whales every year in the North Pacific by Japanese and Russian whalers, because a whale scientist came to us who knew what was going on and said, you guys are the only ones who know how to go in boats. Everybody else is marching down the street with a placard in the environmental movement, but you need to go out there and get in front of those harpoons and get some video. And that's what we did. And when we came into San Francisco with the shot of the harpoon going over our guys into a whale, it went around the world. It just went completely viral. And that was the beginning of a long ride. 79, we created Greenpeace International. I became one of the directors of Greenpeace International from then till 86 when I left. As we evolved, we more or less went from issues that had to do with peace to more that to do with the environment, like whales and baby seals and toxic wastes and stuff like that. And so the peace kind of got dropped. And whereas we had a strong humanitarian orientation in the beginning to save civilization from all-out nuclear war, in other words, we thought people were worthy. By the time I was leaving Greenpeace, the environmental movement had taken to calling humans as the enemies of the earth, the enemies of nature, as if we were the only bad species out of 1.7 million. And it is true that we're different from all the other species, but clams are quite a bit different from eagles too. So I just don't see how you can single out the human species as if we're the only ones with original sin, as in extreme religion, which says that we're born evil kind of thing, or with evil in us. And I just don't believe that. I believe that most people are actually inherently good. Otherwise, we couldn't exist. If 50% of the people were bad, it would not work. And because we're a social animal and we have to cooperate with each other. And we are well aware of our impacts on the environment. The problem is many of those are fake, made up. to scare people about the future of the Earth. And this is where I come in with my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, documenting one after the other of scare stories that are being told to the public, being financed by politicians to get the science they need in order to give the megaphone of the media and the activists the ability to communicate this widespread around the world. And suddenly we have a climate catastrophe, a climate emergency, when actually there's nothing unusual about the climate at all today. It's been getting warmer for 300 years, very, very slowly after the Little Ice Age, which peaked in 1700. And I could go back into history for 500 million years and talk about the relationship between the various factors. But when it comes right down to it, there is no strong correlation between CO2 and temperature in the long Earth's history, except at certain times when it can be explained that actually it was the temperature that caused the CO2 to change.
Isn't part of the issue being that we're pulling a lot of oil and gas out of the earth and just pushing tons and tons of CO2 in the atmosphere?
It's another thing people don't understand is all the fossil fuels are the product of life. In other words, the product of photosynthesis. In other words, the product of solar energy. They think it's something from Mars. I don't know who they thought planted it here, but actually it was grown in forests and in the sea. Oil and gas is from marine sediments, and coal is from forest sediment, forests being buried and turning into coal over millions of years. So what we're doing by burning fossil fuels is putting the CO2 back in the atmosphere that the plants took out and got buried in the ground. So it's not as if we're adding new CO2 to the atmosphere. CO2 has declined dramatically over the last 500 million years, and especially over the last 150 million years, because life is taking it out of the oceans and the air and putting it into sediments. Inadvertently, life actually presaged the end of life when the CO2 went down so low that plants could no longer survive. And we weren't far from that in the most recent glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. And all of this can be looked up on the internet. Even Wikipedia has this on it. The history of the Earth. People really should look at the history of the Earth before they buy into this modern day apocalypse theory that we are killing the Earth with CO2, when in fact CO2 is the basis of all life on Earth. Every single one of the individual life forms that exist on Earth is made with carbon from carbon dioxide. There's no other way to get it.
But isn't it poison? Isn't it going to suffocate all of us?
They're told that air pollution is a evidence of CO2, evidence of global warming. No, it isn't. That's soot that makes air pollution, particulate matter. It's not CO2. CO2 is an invisible gas that is used by all plants along with water. Add CO2 plus H2O, you get glucose, which is sugar, which is the energy for all life. There are a few of these subjects where you can sum up the whole thing in a very small sentence. CO2 is the basis of all life. The sugar that is made by photosynthesis is the energy for all life, including our own every day. So it's like our fuel. The sugars and fats and oils, which are derived from sugars initially, all the carbohydrates are our fuel. We get our proteins from nitrogen and other elements, but the key ones are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they are from water and carbon dioxide. That's as simple as that. And hardly everybody is rejecting that for some reason and thinking the world is coming to an end and making deals to end fossil fuels and ban pipelines and all this stuff, when in fact that is just like the sun is the energy for all plants. Fossil fuels have become the energy for most of civilization, 80%, that is.
When you were talking about Greenpeace and the change in the environmental movement, and now you see this movement that is kind of condemning people, what do you think why is there a motive to condemn people?
I think it's similar to when they threw virgins in volcanoes and burned witches at the stake. this is a narrative of what's causing the weather. And it started out with global warming. And that was easy because there is global warming. It's a natural phenomenon that started, as I say, 300 years ago, long before we burnt a gallon of gasoline. And so there's that. Then they said, when it didn't warm very much for a period of 20 years, and that's how climate works, it goes in fits and starts, but it's generally going up now and can be expected to for about 500 years. So another 200 years of very slight warming if it does what it did for the last 6,000. And because there was a medieval warming period 1,000 years ago and a Roman warm period 2,000 years ago and a Minoan warm period 3,000 years ago. This is well documented with marine sediment cores and ice cores from all around the world. And so then they said, no, it's climate change. And then suddenly they could attribute human activity to nearly anything that happened in the climate. But if you said, well, it was a really cold winter last year, that doesn't seem to go along with your idea. They say, oh, no, that's not climate, that's just weather. Nowadays, all they talk about is the weather and extreme weather events. So it's evolved through, as each time they were debunked or it didn't look like they were exactly perfectly right, they've changed their story to now every hurricane and every flood and every storm, now they call it a storm bomb or something when a storm is coming to British Columbia across the Pacific. It's just a storm. And we've been getting them ever since I was born, which was 74 years ago. And I think they were happening before that too. And indeed, far more extreme weather events have occurred in the past than anything we've seen in the last 100 years. There was a drought in the US Southwest in California and Arizona, et cetera, that lasted 200 years, around 1,200 years ago. That's thought to be what caused the Anasazi people, the cliff dwellers, to disappear, basically. They had to go somewhere else because it was too dry to grow their crops. And there's many other examples, like the Thames River during the cold period in the Little Ice Age froze over regularly. They have paintings of big winter fairs with tents and everything out on the Thames River. It hasn't frozen over since 1814. Again, that was long before anything we could have done with CO2 and fossil fuels would have affected anything. It just has not frozen over again once. That's because there is a slight warming trend in the climate of the Earth today, and they are blaming that on people. And they're not burning witches or throwing virgins into volcanoes, but they are threatening to destroy modern civilization and the entire economy with their net zero fantasy and their wind and solar fantasy, that as if that can run civilization. So it's no different than the doomsday stories of the past. And they're basing the whole thing on an invisible molecule, carbon dioxide, which is only at 0.042% in the global atmosphere, is a slight greenhouse gas. Yes, it is, but many people feel it's already saturated to the point where it doesn't have any meaningful effect anymore. It did at the beginning of less parts per million. It's just completely ridiculous to think that we are the cause of this. All the scare stories today are based on things that are either invisible or remote, like polar bears and coral reefs, invisible like CO2 and radiation, and it can also be both invisible and remote, like coral reefs, which are underwater and far away. So they can make up any story they want. So politicians are paying scientists. All this research is coming from public money, with politicians getting their bureaucrats to give money to scientists. That part of it is in the shadows. Nobody ever talks about that when a new study is announced that scientists have done, right? Those scientists have been paid with public money in a political process. Whereas when GM or DuPont or 3M do science, they do it with private funding to try to make something better. They're not trying to prove that the end of the world is coming. Whereas the politicians are happy with an end of the world story because they can use it to breed fear. You're driving down the highway in your SUV, you're afraid you're killing your grandchildren. That's fear. That makes you feel guilty, because it's your fault. And fear and guilt together are a really easy way to get people to open their wallets and be obedient. And that's the way it works. It's very simple. But the truth is, most of these scare stories, I call it the unified theory of scare stories, in fact. And even though the title of my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, seems somewhat sensationalist, it is not. These are fake invisible catastrophes. They say they're happening right now. The climate catastrophe, the climate emergency, implies that it's not a prediction, that it's actually occurring at this very moment. So this is in real time. But then there are the predictions, what I call threats of doom. And as Niels Bohr, the Nobel physicist winner, way back, this is attributed to Yogi Berra because he popularized it, said it very clearly. Predictions are difficult, especially about the future, because the future is different than history. History is now and the past. Well, now is becoming history every second. But the future is not something you can investigate, right? Because it didn't happen yet.
With CO2 in the ocean, really, when you look at the overall carbon cycle, wouldn't the ocean be the largest part of that cycle? And as we go from a glacial period into a warming period, that as ice melts and kind of stirs up carbon from the bottom of the ocean, because during warming periods, you have the plankton kind of eating the carbon. As it cools, they sink to the bottom. And then as it warms, the melting ice kind of pushes it back up to the surface. When you think of the surface area of the ocean as a whole, you would think that would have the largest influence on the carbon cycle and then therefore life on the planet. Or am I wrong on that?
Well, it's not that you're wrong. It's that it's very difficult to calculate all the carbon cycle in the oceans compared to calculating it in the atmosphere where we are in, and it's a 3D situation. For us, the oceans is the surface. And below that, it's very hard to measure the whole thing. There's huge cycles going on with all the underwater currents and surface currents, and the carbon cycle in the ocean is hard to measure. But we do know that the oceans contain nearly 50 times as much carbon dioxide as the atmosphere. We do know that the atmosphere and the oceans where they meet at the surface cause CO2 to be in equilibrium, basically, because it goes, when the oceans warm, they give off CO2. When the oceans cool, they absorb CO2. That's why during the glacial cycles, you see CO2 and temperature going in rhythm with each other. And Al Gore said, look, can't you see it? There it is. The CO2 is causing the temperature to go up. But the best fact about that is we know, is that there's an 800-year lag between when the temperature goes up and the CO2 goes up. It's because the Earth is warming due to the solar cycles. They're called the Milankovitch cycles. They're the result of the gravitational force of Jupiter, and they have 3 of them that have 100,000 year, 42,000 years, and 21,000 year cycles. And that's what causes these ice age periods and interglacial periods in this Pleistocene ice age that we've been locked into for 2.6 million years now. See, people think the Earth is getting too warm, and they think there's too much CO2. When in fact, this is the coldest period in 250 million years. It's another ice age that we are in. The last one was the Karoo, which ended 250 million years ago and went back into a warmer Earth, which lasted until this one started. Although it was 50 million years ago, the Eocene thermal maximum, people can look it up and see graphs and everything. Since the Eocene thermal maximum, we have been in a cooling period that descended into this Pleistocene ice age, which we arbitrarily, more or less, say started 2.6 million years ago. And both poles and many of the higher elevation areas became locked in ice as a result of that, and continue to be so. Even in this warm interglacial period, there is still a vast amount of ice on Antarctica and on the Arctic. The Northern Hemisphere is warmer than the Southern Hemisphere because the Northern Hemisphere is mostly land, whereas the Southern Hemisphere is mostly water, mostly sea. And it takes way more energy to heat seawater than it does to heat the land. So the Antarctic froze over millions of years before the Arctic did as we descended into this cool period. So it's not too warm now. It's colder than it's been for 250 million years. Secondly, CO2 is not too high. As a matter of fact, it decreased to 180 parts per million at the height of the most recent glaciation. I call it the most recent glaciation rather than the last glaciation, because that could imply that there won't be another one, that it was the last one, right? There's no reason to believe that. In fact, the Iceland green cores and marine sediment cores indicate that the Holocene interglacial period, which we're in now, and is about, depending on how you look at it, 10 or 12,000 years old, we're kind of at the end of it. And already for 6,000 years, there has been a net decline in the Earth's temperature. It's gone up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, but it's downward in general. So when this warming period ends and turns into a cooling period again, if it follows the last 6,000 year pattern, which we don't know for sure, then we will gradually, over 80,000 years, go back into another glacial maximum. That's been the pattern for 2.6 million years. There's been over 40 of these cycles during that time. And there's no reason to believe we aren't descending into the next one. And who knows what the effect of that will be, but we're not going to have to run as the ice descends upon Canada again and covers it in a mile of ice. We don't even have to walk. I mean, you could crawl and you'd get south faster than you had to. So right. It's not as if it's not a cataclysmic event. Actually, when you come out of a major glaciation, it happens quickly in 10,000 years. And then you have a 10,000 year interglacial period, and then it takes 80,000 years. So these are 100,000 year cycles that we've been experiencing for the last million years. Before that, it was 42,000 year cycles. And this is called the Pleistocene conundrum, because we don't know why it changed from 42,000 cycles after many glacial periods. That graph is also easily found. It's a 5.5 million year history from marine sediment cores. They drill down into the marine sediments. They can see all the layers and they can age them, and they can figure out the temperature and CO2 level and some other gases as well. And that's a very interesting graph, because it just shows how erratic the climate has been in the last 2.5 million years. And that's a short time in geologic history. 2.5 million years is a blink, but it's been a very busy blink compared to previous eras when it stayed steady for long periods of time. The real effect of carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere is to increase the growth of the rate of trees and food crops and all other plants in the world. You see, right now, CO2 is at 420 parts per million. Commercial greenhouse growers worldwide generally put CO2 in their greenhouses to take it up to 800 to 1,200 parts per million. There's an economic limit. The plants would grow even more if you put it up to 2,000 parts per million, but there's a curve that levels off as you go up. So the economic sweet spot is 800 to 1,200 parts per million. In other words, double and triple what the air is today. In other words, all those plants out there growing on the mountains are starving for CO2. They would like to have 2 to 3 times as much for optimum growth, given the water and the minerals they have in the soil. That's what they want in the air, because that's like, people think trees are made from the soil. But no, trees are made from air and water almost entirely, with a few minerals that come from the soil that came from the rocks below, which are referred to as the parent material in soil formation. But the trees make the soil. If the trees weren't there, there wouldn't be any dirt. Or if the Great Plains of grass weren't there, there wouldn't be any dirt. There'd just be rocks. So there's so many important things to think about And everybody's fixated on this climate emergency, which is a totally bogus narrative, or they like to call it, I like to call it a story, because it's basically a fairy tale. That's more like it. It's a fairy tale. And yet the whole world is focused on this, with great dignitaries and great scientists like John Kerry and Al Gore and Greta Thunberg are leading the way in this, right? It's so phony that it's ridiculous. And the scientists are just tools for these politicians who are creating the narrative in the public space, in media, and the activists who are marching down the streets with placards saying net zero. It's totally fake. And my book proves it. Here's my book right here. Proves that the fake invisible catastrophes are fake.